Hi. Okay. Today, I want to talk about vintage jewelry because I get so many questions about like all of my vintage pieces, how to shop for vintage jewelry, where to find it, what to look for. And I am not an expert. Like, there are people out there that know so much more about vintage jewelry than I do. I'm just learning from like following people on Instagram. I'm not an expert, and you could actually like be certified in a lot of this stuff and take courses and everything. So definitely like worth, you know, reading up on it yourself. But this is kind of just like the like for dummies version that I've sort of been abiding by. So let me do like a quick rundown of all of my vintage pieces, and then I'll kind of talk about where I get them. So I have one vintage charm that goes on a necklace. This thing is so dainty and tiny, but it's really cool. It's a ring box, and then when you open it, there's actually a little ring inside. It's so cute. It's really hard to see because it's dainty, but so that's like adorable. And I love charms. I love vintage charms specifically because they're all just so unique and so different. But that one was from a store that my mom found. It was a gift from my mom, and it was from like an antique store in Rhode Island. So that's like a great place to find vintage jewelry, is antique stores, or like those big kind of antique sales that happen every year all around the country. That's a great place to find vintage jewelry because it's just so many sellers in one place, and you can kind of poke around and look at all different styles. And then let's do bracelets. I have two vintage bracelets. I don't think I've ever talked about these. Maybe I've talked about this one, but this one is a tennis bracelet, and it's basically just little gold X's, and then the diamonds are the O's, which I think are really cute. This was also a gift from my mom. And I love this. She got this same thing from an antique store, I think in Massachusetts or something, like in her area. Something cool about buying vintage, and something like kind of smart to think about when you buy vintage, is whether or not the seller is like really jacking up the price. So this is 14 karat, this bracelet. And it has diamonds, obviously, but the diamonds are pretty small. It's pretty old, you can kind of tell. I don't know how clear the diamonds are or like if they're great quality, but my mom told me that when she bought it, he actually sold everything by the weight, which I feel like is a really nice way for vintage sellers to work. So he would just weigh the pieces and sell you the item based on the total weight of the gold. It's also kind of nice because a lot of the vintage stuff, like there were common styles in those eras. So this bracelet is like, I've seen similar ones on Instagram from vintage sellers. And you can kind of use that to benchmark like how much you should be paying for that item, if that makes sense. This bracelet is also vintage. I love it because it's mixed metal. So it's white and yellow gold. And I like it because it's like bendy. I love bangles and cuffs, but I don't like how like confined they are on my wrist. Like they really sort of are a little bit uncomfortable because you can't move them in any way. And I like that this moves and is sort of really like flexible and comfy. So this one, like I said, is white and yellow gold. It has these sort of screw designs, which I think is really cool. And I got this from a vintage seller on Instagram. I'll put her handle right here. She's amazing. I do a lot of vintage shopping on Instagram, vintage jewelry shopping, and I just follow sellers that sell a bunch of vintage jewelry and just keep tabs when they do drops and then claim items like through DMs, and that works really well for me. And a lot of times they're fairly willing to negotiate on price too, which is nice. So yeah, this one's amazing. I love it so much. I think both of these are like 7.25 inches, which I kind of like bigger bracelets. I like when they sort of dangle like that. So next up, let's talk about rings. This ring is like my favorite vintage ring that I own. And it's the one that's part of my wedding stack now. And it's basically like a channel cut, which I think is super interesting, like pave band with these kind of unique like chevron designs on the side. And it's shaped like a square, which is pretty cool. I got this on Instagram too. I'll put her seller's name right here. The way that like a lot of buying stuff on Instagram, especially when it's for vintage goes, that I've found is that like certain sellers, like stuff will fly. If you don't DM them within like a minute of them posting that item, it's not going to be available. And so what I tend to do is just sort of like, it's honestly just luck I think, because I'm not like on Instagram all day, every day trying to buy stuff. It's more like if I'm scrolling through Instagram and I see something that's really pretty and I'm like, oh my God, I love that. I usually just reach out, even if I'm not 100% sure about buying it, because the chances that it's already been sold are high. So I just will DM them and be like, oh my God, that ring is amazing. Is it still available? And you know, half the time they'll be like, no, sorry, it just sold. And I'll be like, okay, never mind. But every once in a while, it's still available. And then I'll ask more questions about it. Be like, is it 14 karat? Like, is it solid? Is it hollow? Are they diamonds or like cubic zirconia? How much are you asking for it? And then we'll kind of get into the nitty gritty. And I try to just make sure that like I ask questions like that. I feel like most of these sellers are super genuine and they often take pictures of the stamp. Like this one has a stamp, you know, 14 karat stamp inside the band. They'll often take pictures of that and post it as part of like the item description. So you know you're getting a solid gold piece. And then they'll post like the total carat weight of the diamonds and all these other stats. Oh, I love this ring. This one is actually from a place in New York called Showplace. And it's in Midtown. It's really close to Grand Central. And it's like a, you know, 5-story store with all of these vendors in it and everything is vintage. They have homeware, they have jewelry, they have cufflinks, they have furniture, and it's all just different like vintage sellers. It's amazing. I love it there. I stumbled upon it. I had never been before and sort of was walking by and was like, holy, that is so cool. I gotta go in. And now I love it. And this ring is a belt buckle ring and solid gold and diamonds. And I love it so much. This is like one of my favorite pieces too. I think it's just so unique. I've always wanted a belt buckle ring, but I feel like people don't make them that much anymore. So it's cool to find one vintage because they used to be a huge style in like the earlier 1900s. So it's a nice way to get one because they're not that common anymore. But yeah, love that one. And then that's nice because you can actually shop in person. So there were a bunch of different vendors there and you can kind of just poke around and find stuff that you like. The next vintage ring that I've talked about is this tiny little heart signet pinky ring that I love. It's so cute. It has the 2 little double hearts. I just wear it on my pinky. I think it's so precious. And this one I got in person as well at a jewelry store, not an antique or vintage store, but a jewelry store in Cape Cod. And they had a case in the back for vintage stuff and estate jewelry. And the guy was similar. He sold this by the weight. So I think this was literally like 75 bucks or something because it's really light. But yeah, I love that one. It's, you know, benefit of shopping in person. Same thing is that you can see it, you can try it on, you know which finger you want to wear it on. So this next one I got on Etsy, I think. I don't even think I found this on Instagram. I think I was just browsing Etsy and it came up as like a suggested item for me, but I'll put the name of the Etsy seller right here. And they have a ton of vintage stuff. And I feel like it's very fairly priced. Like this is a very thin, dainty ring. It's not a lot of metal, so it shouldn't be expensive because it's just very light and it's cubic zirconia, not diamond. So I feel like it was fairly priced for how much gold it is. And they shipped really fast, which was awesome. When it comes to shopping on Etsy for vintage stuff or not, I feel like people have been scammed on Etsy before, and I've heard stories of like people buying something that they say it's solid gold and then it shows up and it's gold plated, or they say it's diamonds and they show up and it's cubic zirconia. And I think for me, I just try really hard to shop from sellers that have like a ton of reviews and like 4 or 5-star ratings, and then there's actually photos at the bottom where people submit photos of the product that they bought and then they give a review. I try to kind of limit my search to stuff like that because then I just know that it's like legit, they sell a lot of stuff, they have really good reviews, and I can kind of trust them more. And I always look for that stamp, the 14 karat or 10 karat stamp in the photos. And if it's not in the photo, I'll message the seller and ask them to take a photo of it and share it with me so that I know that it's solid and not plated. So those are just kind of like tips and tricks for shopping on Etsy because I know it can be a bit of a toss up and there's just so much stuff on Etsy. You want to make sure that like you're buying something legit. So the last vintage ring I got is probably my newest vintage ring, and this one is really unique. It's so sparkly. It's like a bomb ring, a bomb ring, like a very giant dome ring. And I think it's 10 karat gold. You can see on the back. I know it's not 14 karat, I think it's 10. And then it has diamonds sort of like scattered throughout. It looks like it's all diamonds. It's actually not. There's a decent amount of like white gold sprinkled in with the diamonds to just give it like a shinier illusion without it being like totally crusted with diamonds. But then it has these little like S shapes on it, kind of, with like black diamonds inside. And I think it's so cool. It's very much like a statement piece. Like I feel like I wouldn't wear this every day, but more maybe like if I'm going out to dinner or have like an event and just want something like really cool and chunky, I would wear this just because it's a bit more like of a statement. But this one I got from this seller. I found them on Instagram, but they have a giant website. Sometimes like buying vintage on Instagram, they don't have websites or anything, so you have to do it all through DM and like shopping on Instagram. But then sometimes like this seller, they have a giant website and you can just like buy right from there and then they ship and you kind of have more of like a traditional e-com experience. So that was this seller, and they're huge in like the vintage resell space. They have like 100,000 followers on Instagram and they are always listing products. So they're a great option. I feel like everything is very like affordably priced. So yeah, those are all my vintage pieces as of right now. There will be more. Oh wait, no, I have one necklace. This necklace, I've talked about this one before, but it's like the braided, like 3 braided chains. And I got this one from a store in Cape Cod as well. It was a vintage store and they had a jewelry section. So love this one. It's the best. I think it's so pretty. I wear it every single day and it's just like simple, like easy to wear. Okay, so those are all my vintage pieces. Now I'm done. But let me talk about some like tips and tricks for buying vintage, because I think like there are a couple things I've learned. I think it's easy to get overwhelmed or just tempted to buy things when you see them, especially if you're shopping on Instagram and you're just scrolling through these vintage accounts and you're looking at all of the different vintage pieces. It's tempting to just want to like buy everything. What I've found is that there were very popular styles throughout the time. So if you're looking for a buckle ring, like a belt buckle ring, or if you're looking for one of these like XO diamond tennis bracelets, there are gonna be more of them because that was a very common style in whatever year that it was made. And there's gonna be more of them for you to find. So if you're not ready to buy it that day, or you don't have the money to buy it that day, don't feel pressured to do so because it's probably gonna get sold within a matter of minutes. It almost creates like a scarcity mindset where you're like, oh, I need to buy it. Like somebody else is gonna get it if I don't get it right now. Don't look at it like that, or else you're just gonna end up buying a bunch of stuff that you don't really actually want. You just were worried that somebody else would buy. I would just look at it like there's always gonna be a beautiful piece out there that you could buy. And especially if you're like me and you follow like hundreds of vintage sellers on Instagram, it's tempting. But what I've learned is that it's the best thing you can do is to not buy stuff and wait for the piece that like you really are obsessed with. So the way that like I've found my favorite pieces is like rings like this that I'm just so obsessed with, is that I looked at them and knew I needed them in my collection. There was not a shadow of a doubt of like, oh, I don't really know if I need this, or I kind of like it, but I don't love it. If you're ever like, I kind of like it and I don't love it, don't get it, because there's so many options out there. That's just gonna be how you buy stuff that you don't love. And then you just are like, oh, I wanna sell this or get rid of it. Like wait and get something that is like amazing, you know? So that's like my advice with vintage. It's tempting to just get it all because there's so much stuff out there once you get into the world of vintage shopping, but be patient and wait for stuff that you really actually love. That is when it's worth it. Another tip is that I find that shopping at vintage stores is typically better prices than shopping at jewelry stores that carry vintage stuff, if that makes sense. So like find a vintage store that carries jewelry instead of finding a jewelry store that carries vintage. Because I've noticed that the jewelry shops that carry vintage tend to jack up the prices a little bit, but the vintage shops that carry jewelry tend to be very fairly priced, just from my experience. It's a little bit harder because not every vintage store or antique store carries jewelry, but when you find one that does, they're usually way better prices. Always make sure to look for the stamp to make sure that it's solid gold, or if you want something sterling silver or you know, whatever else. Always look for the stamp, and don't be afraid to ask the seller, do you mind sending me a picture of the stamp? Or if it's diamonds, do you mind sending me like the details, the certifications on the diamonds? Because they'll probably have that information, and you want to make sure that you know what you're getting. So don't be afraid to ask for stuff like that. And I think that's it. Honestly, I love shopping for vintage jewelry because I just feel like it's such a cool way to have pieces and like give them a second life, and to find pieces that are unique and not kind of made nowadays, because they're just, the style has changed. So it's cool to find stuff that has like kind of gone out of style and is coming back into style, and then like modern jewelers aren't really making it nowadays. It just makes it fun. So yeah, I think that's it for this video. Let me know if you guys have any questions. As always, I can answer them in the comments, but I will see you in the next one. Bye.